The story of Tatum O'Neal stays with anyone who hears it, though the young girl seen in Paper Moon was concealing a much darker reality behind her well-known face. She entered the world on November 5, 1963, in Los Angeles, born into Hollywood royalty as the daughter of actor Ryan O'Neal and actress Joanna Moore. From the very beginning, fame, camera lights, and adult disorder surrounded her. Looking from the outside, one might have believed she had everything a child could want. But inside her household, things were already falling apart. When she was only 3 years old, her parents separated in 1967, and that early break changed everything. Her father quickly remarried, then more relationships followed, and more children joined the family, making the entire situation harder to keep together. As time passed, that family network grew even more complicated, including Griffin O'Neal from her mother's side, plus Patrick and Redmond O'Neal from her father's later relationships. Instead of being raised in one steady home with a predictable daily rhythm, Tatum found herself surrounded by constant movement, uncertainty, and emotional noise. The adults in her world were busy handling their own struggles, and those struggles often silenced what the children truly needed. This is the point where her story begins to read less like a typical Hollywood upbringing and more like a fight for survival. Reports show that her mother eventually lost custody because of addiction and legal difficulties, and Tatum herself has said she was sent back and forth between parents, boarding schools, and different houses before she even became a teenager. So even with a famous last name, there was nothing stable beneath her. She never had the kind of steady routine that most children require. She grew up in a setting where insecurity showed up early and stuck around. Her mother later passed away from lung cancer at age 63, and by that time, the harm done in those early years had already become deeply woven into the fabric of Tatum's life. While that shaky childhood was still happening, something extraordinary took place. Tatum O'Neal did not enter the film world through the usual slow, step-by-step process. There was no long preparation period, no years of acting classes, and no carefully planned child star strategy. Instead, director Peter Bogdanovich chose her for Paper Moon when she was just 8 years old, even though she had never received any formal acting training. She played Addie Loggins, a sharp and unusually tough little con artist, while her real father, Ryan O'Neal, played the trickster alongside her. That single fact gave the movie a strange and powerful energy, because the father and daughter shown on screen were also father and daughter in real life, and that truth is what made the performance hit so deeply. Tatum was not simply cute or appealing in the usual child actor way. She came across as fast, strong, natural, and completely absorbed in the character. The role itself was difficult, since Addie was written with the intelligence and rough edge of someone much older than a child. So the movie needed a girl who could handle that weight without seeming forced. Somehow, Tatum did exactly that. She turned 9 while filming in the autumn of 1972. When the picture came out in 1973, audiences could almost instantly sense that this was no ordinary child performance. It felt special right from the beginning. Then came the event that made everything even more stunning. On April 7, 1974, Tatum O'Neal won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. She was only 10 years old, and that victory made her the youngest competitive Oscar winner ever. What makes this accomplishment even more striking is realizing how young she truly was. Most children that age are still deep in elementary school, still learning simple classroom routines and playground friendships, while Tatum had already delivered one of the most discussed performances in film history and had defeated grown adults for one of Hollywood's highest honors. She also took home the Golden Globe for New Star of the Year, which made it obvious that the industry did not see her as a one-time surprise. For a short while, it seemed like everything had opened up for her at once. That sudden rise could have easily faded after just one film, but it did not. Instead, Tatum moved into the next stage of her career with remarkable speed. What made her early run so impressive was not only that she won an Oscar so young, but that she kept appearing in major movies and rapidly became a reliable teenage star. By 1976, she was already proving that Paper Moon was no accident. In The Bad News Bears, she played Amanda Wurlitzer, the hard-throwing kid who transforms the destiny of the whole team. That part mattered because the film did not treat children as cute little extras standing around for laughs. The kids were rude, messy, competitive, and completely alive. Within that disorder, Tatum's calm ability stood out even more. The performance helped turn the movie into one of the most unforgettable early successes of her career, and it showed that she could grab attention in a completely different type of story. That same year, she also appeared in Nickelodeon, once again directed by Peter Bogdanovich, with Ryan O'Neal and Burt Reynolds. This was important for another reason. She was still very young, but she was already traveling through serious Hollywood circles, surrounded by big film names and stories about the movie business itself. At around 13, she played a girl writing movie scripts, which gave the whole thing an odd feeling. She was still a child, yet she was already being drawn deeper into adult creative spaces. Then, in International Velvet in 1978, she moved into a more high-prestige kind of project and worked alongside actors such as Christopher Plummer and Anthony Hopkins, demonstrating that she could go beyond child roles. After that came Little Darlings in 1980, and that film helped shift her image once more. She was no longer just the little girl from Paper Moon. She was now being viewed as a teenage star. That transition is where many child actors break down or vanish. Yet for a while, Tatum managed to keep progressing. She continued to get film roles. She kept her name relevant. She remained visible in an industry that usually moves on very fast. Yet that early success did not lead to the stable adult career people might have expected. In fact, this is where the story takes a turn. The same girl who had become the youngest Oscar winner in history at age 10 did not develop into a smooth Hollywood success story. Instead, the following years became defined by addiction, family destruction, and a career that never truly found consistent footing again. That sharp contrast is what makes her later life so painful to consider. After her early fame, her film work slowed down dramatically. Rather than becoming a regular leading actress with one major part after another, she went through long periods with only a few projects. For someone who had started from such an unbelievable height, that drop feels especially severe. Hollywood often has trouble with child stars. It loves them when they are young, shiny, and easy to market. But once they get older, the way forward becomes much less clear. In Tatum's situation, she seemed to get stuck in the image of being a young genius. And once that image faded, the industry no longer seemed to know what to do with her. At the same time, her public identity began to change in a painful manner. She was no longer talked about only as an actress. Increasingly, she became part of a different kind of discussion, one involving family chaos, addiction, and the damage that fame can leave behind. That shift did not happen suddenly in one single moment. It grew over time, and that is what makes it feel so heavy. Her downfall was not one bad movie or one difficult year. It was a long slide, with different kinds of pain arriving at different moments. By the time later interviews came around, that harm was visible in ways that were hard to overlook. In one 2025 interview, she showed up with a cane after a 2020 overdose that had caused a stroke, and she also mentioned struggling to recall important names during the conversation. That detail says a great deal because it reveals how deep the consequences truly went. This was no longer just a story about lost fame or a fading career. It had affected her health, her memory, and her everyday life. And that is why her story remains with people. At 10 years old, she stood at the peak of Hollywood in a way almost no child ever has. But later, her name became linked not only to talent, but also to survival. The same life that started with fame and impossible success also carried instability, public pain, addiction, and loss. So when people look back at Tatum O'Neal, they are not just looking at the youngest Oscar winner in history. They are looking at someone whose life shows how early success can freeze a person in the public mind, while real life keeps getting harder behind that image. What makes it even more haunting is the distance between the beginning and everything that followed. She was born into celebrity, rose faster than almost anyone expected, and reached a level of recognition that most actors never touch. But none of that shielded her. Not from the disorder at home, not from the pressure of early fame, not from the damage that followed. And that is what gives her story its weight. It begins with Hollywood, but it never really feels like a fairy tale. It feels like a child standing in the middle of brightness, while everything around her keeps slipping out of place. Tatum O'Neal's marriage to John McEnroe started like the kind of story that tabloids love. When they came together in 1984, people saw a famous actress and a tennis superstar and expected glamour, headlines, and drama, and they got all of that, but not in the way anyone would have wished. What began as a celebrity romance slowly turned into a very public breakdown, and once the cracks started to show, the story only grew louder. She met McEnroe in 1984 after moving into a Central Park West apartment in New York City, and from there, the relationship quickly became one of the most watched celebrity pairings of that era. 2 years later, in 1986, they married. By then, McEnroe was already one of the biggest names in tennis, and Tatum was still famous as the youngest Oscar winner in history. On the surface, they looked like a power couple, but the marriage lasted only 6 years. They separated in 1992 and divorced in 1994, and what came after hit even harder than the split itself. That was because the breakup did not remain private. It turned into accusations, custody battles, and a long public fight that kept feeding the tabloids. Their 3 children, Kevin, Sean, and Emily, made everything feel heavier. At that point, the story was no longer just about 2 famous people falling apart. It became a story about family damage, children caught in the middle, and a woman being dragged back into scandal in front of everyone. After the divorce, O'Neal's drug problems returned, and her later heroin addiction became part of the public image that followed her for years. And that is what makes the next part of her life so difficult to read, because by then it was becoming clear that the disorder in adulthood had roots stretching much further back. Still, the deeper story was never only about career. It was also about survival. And that becomes painfully clear when the next chapter arrives. In May 2020, Tatum O'Neal overdosed on prescription pain medication and was later found unconscious at her home in Century City, California. What followed was not one medical emergency, but several at once. Doctors said the overdose triggered a stroke, and reports also mentioned cardiac arrest and seizures. Then came the part that made everything even more terrifying. She spent about 6 weeks in a coma. At that point, the fear was no longer abstract. Her son later said the family worried she might never speak, see, or hear normally again. That detail says everything about how serious the situation was. This was not a close call, followed by a quick recovery. It was a moment when the people around her believed they might lose her completely. Later, O'Neal herself called surviving it a miracle. But waking up was only the beginning. After the coma, the hardest part was not just being alive, it was living with the damage left behind. At first, she reportedly had no words at all. Doctors warned that she could have been left blind, deaf, or unable to speak. Recovery meant relearning basic life skills through long stretches of therapy. She had to work on speaking again. She had to work on walking again. Everything became harder, slower, and more uncertain. The emotional weight of it all was even heavier because this happened during the COVID-19 period, when isolation was already shaping daily life. She was alone with pain, addiction, health problems, and the aftermath of a medical disaster. In later interviews, she said the experience changed her deeply and made her more emotional. That makes sense, because after something like that, survival itself becomes part of the story. By 2025 and 2026, the picture people saw of Tatum O'Neal was very different from the polished image of a glamorous comeback. What they saw instead was something more human and more affecting. A survivor still rebuilding in public. One of the most striking moments came on June 14, 2025, when she appeared at her son Kevin McEnroe's wedding in Napa, California. That day meant more than a family celebration. It also placed her in the same room with John McEnroe for the first time in many years. Earlier in February, she had told Variety that the anger is gone. That line mattered because the history between them had been bitter for decades. They had separated back in 1992 and finalized their divorce in 1994. So this was not just a wedding appearance. It was a rare public sign that an old wound had finally cooled. The most telling detail about how she looks now is not about styling, makeup, or celebrity image. It is about recovery. In February 2025, Variety reported that she entered a studio using a cane because of the stroke she suffered in 2020 after the overdose. The report also said she was still dealing with speech therapy and even trouble remembering names. Those are the kinds of details that cut through any polished surface. They remind you that what happened to her was not symbolic damage, but real damage, physical and lasting. And yet, by 2026, newer coverage showed her smiling brightly in a selfie with her daughter Emily. That image mattered because it suggested a visible change. The woman who had once seemed fragile and exhausted was now being seen as healthier, calmer, and more present. Not fully untouched by what happened, of course. The cane was still there, the history was still there, and the medical damage was still part of her life. But the smile was there, too, and that changed the feeling of the story. That is what makes Tatum O'Neal's life so unusual and so haunting. Fame came first, the pain came later, and it came very publicly. She won an Academy Award at a record-breaking young age, and for a while, that looked like the beginning of a golden life. But decades after that peak, she was nearly lost to addiction, stroke, and long-term medical damage. In 2025, she said she had reached a point where she never wanted to hurt herself again, and that line makes clear how serious the earlier crisis had been.